Ron, how do you define risk, threat, and vulnerability on a system?
A lot of times they're interwoven and people kind of see them all as the same, but they are all slightly different. The risk profile is the likelihood of something really happening. It's a profile of risk. There's high risk, low risk, medium risk. Vulnerability is when there is the way I define it, the way my staff typically defines it, a vulnerability is something where there is a kink in the armor. There's a break in the chain. There's a challenge or a problem with the way something was constructed. It was probably constructed the way it's intended, but over time, that vulnerability shows itself and exposes itself as a high risk. And the criticality of all that depends on how high or low it is. And so for me, it totally depends on the product or the service that me as a CIO or CTO is supporting. Case in point, when I was in pharmaceuticals at Express Scripts, it was a $108 billion company, and we sent out pharmacy drugs through Walgreens, CVS, you name it. We had to make sure that the PII and all the HIPAA rules were, number one, protected. And so that was what we insulated the most. That's where we ring fenced the most. However, when I moved to HP, for example, it was the schematics of how our systems operate. The IP that we have behind the technology, which is within a laptop, for example. And here today, what I'm protecting the most are the digital identities of the children we serve and help, but also the donors that are very generous to help those children. So that is kind of what I want to ring fence the most. And so vulnerability and risk, that is my my calculus of what I'm focused on the most in those three areas. But it's very important that you really understand what you're protecting the most, and then having a right definition of the level of criticality around that. There's more on that one, but I'll pause because I could take that answer into another 30 minutes. But I think that kind of captures the essence of the answer.
Riya, do you have anything to add here?
Yeah, definitely, Brandon. Yeah, I love what you said, Ron, about the way you think about vulnerabilities, risks, and threats. I'm with you. And cybersecurity being a newer concept, right, that everyone's really starting to take seriously and recognize it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. We've heard that phrase. If I'm describing cybersecurity as someone who is looking to just get more comfortable or familiar with it or build their own risk culture within their organization, I think of just the basic example. Someone may be breaking into your home. The risk is the chance of something bad happening, like that break-in. And the threat is, that burglar that maybe does show up and tries to break in. And then the vulnerability is it happens because a window's been left open in your home. So I like to qualify it also in those sorts of terms to help people who maybe aren't as familiar or comfortable quite yet, just understand more about risk management, what it means. What do you think, though, Nick?
I really like the kink in the armor analogy there. I mean, I think one thing that I see a lot is most people, when they're thinking about vulnerabilities, they only think about patches and patch management. And I think vulnerabilities is a much broader classification of things than just a patch. It can be a misconfiguration. It could be an architectural issue. It could be, an operational issue, like a process wasn't followed. So there's all kinds of different things that will qualify under a vulnerability, but a vulnerability is what could happen. So to me, it's like what could happen, like where are the holes, where are the kinks in my armor? A threat is like who or what is going to cause that. Like a threat could be something that's, a person, an insider threat or something like that. It could also be a natural disaster that comes along. So a threat of a weather event, flooding your data center or taking something down is another type of threat that just wouldn't be associated to an individual. And then a risk is kind of the combination of those two. So, I think later we'll talk a little bit more about, impact times likelihood equals, risk, and then treatment plans around that and stuff. So a risk is kind of the combination of those two. If a bad person or if a threat is able to exploit a vulnerability, what then happens and what's the outcome of that? And usually we try to tie risks to what is the business impact if that vulnerability was to happen. So like an individual vulnerability against an individual system, not that big of a deal. A vulnerability against your large SAP infrastructure that takes things down has a much bigger business impact, for instance.